You once defended the filibuster as sacred, didn't you? And now you call it a threat to democracy. I think America should expect more consistency from those who sit in the Senate. That sentence struck in the middle of a live broadcast, chilling the entire studio. Not because it was clever, but because it was precise, brutal, and personal. Senator Elizabeth Warren, known for her razor-sharp intellect and unwavering progressivism, had just turned the national conversation away from policy and toward a moment from Ted Cruz's early Senate years, one that had long faded into procedural memory. The camera turned to Cruz. No rebuttal, no smirk, just stillness, as if he wasn't hearing Elizabeth's voice, but a familiar echo from years ago. The early days in Washington when colleagues snickered behind closed doors about his staunch defenses of constitutional tradition, when standing alone felt more like exile than courage. The studio audience leaned forward, tense. The host, Carson Green, blinked, unsure whether to interject. Elizabeth Warren sat back, folding her hands in scholarly confidence, as though she had just scored a victory in a televised deposition. What she didn't know was that a phone call was coming, an old voice, calm, resolute, and one that would shift the entire tone of the night. And if you're still watching this far, let me ask you, have you ever been misjudged because you stayed loyal to something others abandoned? Leave a comment and let us know. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe conviction should not be mocked, even when it goes against the tide. The show, Voice of Values, aired during primetime on Fox Nation, a space designed for unfiltered conservative commentary. The topic on the table tonight, intelligence, representation, in the collapse of institutional integrity. At the center of the broadcast was Elizabeth Warren, Harvard professor turned progressive icon, and across from her sat Senator Ted Cruz, perhaps the most polarizing intellectual on the right. From the first moment, Warren took control of the discussion, her tone deliberate, academic, clinical. Today's politics, she began, is saturated with emotional appeals and religious fervor, disguised as constitutionalism. Her glance slid toward Cruz. At what point does conviction become obstruction? The audience, largely composed of ideological centrists and conservative policy wonks, murmured in response. The camera cut to Cruz. He didn't flinch, didn't respond. He simply adjusted his microphone. Warren continued, more pointed now. You once wept during a floor speech on religious liberty. If someone is that emotional, so moved by personal faith, can they be trusted with secular responsibility? There was a smattering of laughter, not mean-spirited, but nervous, uncertain. Cruz didn't laugh, he didn't blink. He leaned in slightly and spoke. Some cry out of weakness. Some cry because they are finally allowed to speak freely, and some laugh because they've confused moral clarity with melodrama. The room paused, briefly stunned into silence. But Warren didn't relent. She pivoted. I've reviewed your early records, Senator, she said, lifting a folder that may or may not have been empty. You once failed to secure even a single co-sponsor on major legislation. Should this country really place its trust in someone whose peers consistently voted not to stand with him? There was no applause, only tension. How did she even know that? Warren went on, unshaken. I'm not saying isolation disqualifies someone. I'm saying a national representative should command the respect of their colleagues. Cruz exhaled slowly. His voice was lower now. It's true, I've stood alone. I've spoken into silence. I've submitted bills that died in committee without a second glance, but not because I lacked ideas, because the room wasn't ready to hear them. He paused. You think leadership is measured by popularity, but sometimes leadership is choosing to be unpopular for the right reasons. No one asked anything at all. Cruz's voice was steady, almost quiet. He looked directly at Senator Warren now, not defiant, not defensive, but resolute. You think leadership is measured by how many fall in line, by how closely someone tracks with the political majority year after year. Maybe that's one way, but sometimes real intelligence is knowing why someone chooses not to follow the crowd. The studio grew heavier with silence. Warren didn't move. She simply blinked, as if filing away his answer for later attack. Carson Green, the host, sensing the shift, attempted to diffuse the tension. So Senator Cruz, he interjected lightly, in your view, how should we evaluate someone's ability to represent others? Cruz paused, just long enough for it to feel intentional. By whether they dare to use the very stories they were mocked for, to speak for those who never had the microphone. I don't need the whole chamber to agree with me. I just need one person, maybe someone who's ever been silenced, laughed at, or shut out, to know they're not alone. There was no applause, but also no interruption. Only the lens of camera 2 caught a quiet detail. A woman in the third row, her hand clenched since Warren's first accusation. Her jaw was still tight, as if the memory of watching someone stand alone in a boardroom or a school hallway had just returned. No one in the studio said a word after Cruz's answer. His voice was calm, his gaze didn't shift, but the silence didn't last. Warren leaned toward her mic, her tone colder now, more clinical. I'm not denying the political price you've paid, Senator, but what we're discussing here is the qualification to lead a pluralistic nation. Isn't it a contradiction for someone who once alienated their own party to now lecture America on unity and governance? That line didn't mock, it sliced. The audience tightened. Would Cruz answer? Would he show the anger Warren might have hoped for? He didn't. He looked down, turning a page in his notes. Not to read, but to keep his hands from shaking. Carson jumped in, his voice overly bright. Perhaps Senator Warren is referring to professional standards, not personal barbs. But Warren cut him off. I'm speaking about the personal. Senator Cruz is the embodiment of ideological rigidity dressed up as principle. His entire career reflects a trend, lowering the standards of collaboration in the name of preserving outdated ideas. The room fractured. A few voices muttered, "That's right," while others visibly shook their heads. Then Carson received a signal, an audience question, live. He nodded to the back. A young man stood up, tall, composed, wearing a white shirt with a Liberty Law School badge clipped to his belt. I also grew up in a conservative home, he began, but I've never used that as an excuse for ignoring progress. So I want to ask Senator Cruz, if your beliefs consistently isolate you, if you can't work with others, what makes you think you deserve to help write laws in a democracy? It sounded civil, even reasonable, but it stung of arrogance, cloaked in polite words. The studio shifted. Warren smiled faintly, pleased. Carson glanced at Cruz. Cruz turned slowly to the young man. No anger, no rush. What's your name? The young man hesitated. Dylan. Cruz nodded once. Dylan, he said softly. You just used the word excuse. Tell me, do you think a freshman law student chooses to be the only one in the room who won't sign the consensus document? Or that they enjoy the eye rolls, the closed doors, the names? The room went silent. Do you think a person says, I'll make my path harder today because I want to be mocked, to be misquoted, to be alone? Dylan didn't respond. Cruz's voice dropped even lower. No one should have to justify conviction just to be allowed to participate. You don't excuse it, you endure it. And if you're lucky, you survive long enough to lift up someone who'll walk the same road next. Dylan sat down, and that moment, quiet, restrained but clear, was the one viewers would remember. Dylan said nothing more, and that silence, heavy, uncertain, was the exact moment when the audience couldn't look away. Not everyone had ever stood alone in a Senate hearing. Not everyone had ever been filibustered into irrelevance. But nearly everyone had once been misunderstood, labeled by a number, a vote count, or a caricature they didn't choose. Senator Warren leaned forward slightly, sensing the tension and attempting to regain control of the narrative. Well, she said, her tone dry, thank you for the heartfelt speech, Senator. But Congress needs people who make decisions, not people who turn every debate into a personal diary. Cruz answered instantly. This time he didn't lower his eyes. And that, he said, is precisely why our laws keep failing real people. Because too many decisions are made without understanding the personal stories they erase. The room cracked. Some clapped quietly. Others exchanged skeptical glances. The division was no longer just political. It was generational, cultural, even moral. Host Carson Green shifted quickly to the next segment. Audience calls. A light flashed on the console. The call was live. A woman's voice came through, slow, warm, with the weight of memory. My name is Miss Ruth. I used to teach Senator Cruz back when he was just Teddy. No one expected it. Warren gave a half smile, clearly anticipating another sentimental testimonial she could dismiss. But Miss Ruth didn't waver. I tutored him after school, every Thursday. I remember the first week. He came in silent. I asked him, why didn't you respond in class today? He said, no one was listening anyway. The audience stilled. It took weeks before I realized he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to hold on to what he believed even when the room turned against him. He wasn't stubborn, he was brave, and no one ever asked why. The studio was frozen. I'm not calling to defend him. I'm calling to remind you. Sometimes intelligence isn't about how quickly you adapt. It's about refusing to abandon your principles just because they are unpopular. Warren's smirk faded. Carson murmured, thank you, Miss Ruth. That was quite a statement. But she had one more sentence. I'm proud of the young man he was and the one sitting here now, not because he always got it right, but because he never surrendered his conscience just to be accepted. The call ended. No applause, no scripted transitions, just silence. Not the silence of shock, but the kind that follows truth when it's been ignored too long. The camera panned to Elizabeth Warren. She glanced down, pretending to read something, but nothing on her notes could erase what had just been said. Ted Cruz didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply reached down and unzipped the worn leather folio beside him. From it, he pulled a thin, laminated page. The top corner was curled slightly, worn by years of quiet keeping. The camera zoomed in. It was a classroom report, handwritten in blue ink. In the teacher's notes, one line stood out. "This child doesn't need to be corrected, he needs to be heard." Carson flinched. He looked at the studio coordinator, unsure, should they move on? But no cue came. Cruz didn't explain the paper. He didn't justify it. He held it up, steady, close to the microphone, so that every viewer at home could read the line for themselves. Then he spoke, voice even. "This is the sentence I've carried for 30 years. Not out of shame, but because I didn't think anyone would ever care to hear it. Tonight, someone questioned my past. And I figured, if they dare bring it up, I should dare to let it be seen." The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from performance, but from the kind of memory that stays sharp for a lifetime. The page trembled slightly in Cruz's hand, not from the studio lights, not from nerves, but from the quiet, buried memories that never really leave. Senator Warren stayed silent. Her hand rested on her notes, but she no longer turned a page. In the third row, a woman quietly wept. She covered her mouth with both hands, but the soft sound carried. Cruz turned slightly toward her, not to console, not to dramatize, but to nod gently. No words were needed. They understood each other without speaking. Then something unexpected happened. A man in business attire stood up, mid-50s, white, with a name tag that read Tom Garrison, Ohio. He said nothing. He simply placed his hand over his chest and fixed his eyes on Senator Cruz. Another stood, then another. No chants, no slogans, no political sides drawn, just standing, as if to say, we didn't ask before, but we see now and we're done staying silent. Warren scanned the crowd, her posture stiffening. For the first time that evening, she wasn't in command of the room. Carson Green, the host, leaned into his mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask you to remain seated so the program can continue." But no one sat down. Cruz turned to the camera and, with no script, no rehearsal, spoke plainly into the lens. "If you were ever the one who stood alone in a meeting room because your convictions made others uncomfortable, if you were ever told to compromise your values just to be accepted, if you ever wondered whether silence was easier than truth, I stand here tonight, and I haven't forgotten you." Applause rose, not in thunder but in something heavier, recognition. A moment unscripted, a wave of solidarity from people who had felt invisible for too long. Warren adjusted her posture, took a breath, and made a last-ditch pivot. "I believe we're getting a little too emotional here. This is supposed to be a conversation about standards, not sentimental memories and moral pageantry." Just then, another signal came through. Carson hesitated, then nodded to his earpiece. A man's voice echoed through the studio, calm, deep, measured. "I'm a middle school history teacher. In 2004, I was asked to report a student for being disruptive. He kept challenging textbook narratives, but I refused. I knew he wasn't being defiant. He just believed in what he was saying. I don't know who Senator Cruz is beyond this broadcast, but I know there are hundreds like him, kids who weren't wrong, just unwilling to pretend." A pause. "If one of them once stood alone in a Senate chamber and still stands for others today, then that person deserves to be heard, not humiliated." Warren didn't reply. She wasn't defeated, but she had nothing left to counter firsthand truth. Cruz didn't smile. He didn't respond. He simply lowered the old laminated page onto the desk and folded his hands. The next morning, the footage of the exchange flooded every corner of social media, but not as a viral outrage clip, not over-edited or captioned to provoke clicks. It was 38 seconds. Just Cruz holding that piece of paper and saying, "Sorry, no one asked why I was alone in that vote. Tonight someone dared to mock it, so I figured I should dare to share why I stood." It surpassed 4 million views in 10 hours. The hashtag #HeStoodAlone reached #2 nationwide. But the most surprising response came not from Cruz's supporters. It came from Congressman Harold Guffey, a far-right populist who had previously dismissed Cruz as too academic to lead. His post was just a few lines. "I watched last night's exchange 3 times. I'm no longer sure I understand conviction the way I used to. Maybe we've misjudged too many voices because they refuse to blend in. I don't agree with Ted Cruz on every policy, but on this, maybe I need to listen. Maybe we've misjudged too many voices because they didn't speak the way we expected," one conservative congressman admitted quietly online. "I don't agree with Ted Cruz on every policy, but on this, I think I need to listen." The internet exploded. Many conservatives were outraged, accusing Congressman Harold Guffey of being emotionally manipulated. Yet others wrote, "He hasn't switched sides, he's changed his perspective." Just an hour later, Chad Kinter, the seasoned host of the Patriot Line, unexpectedly went live. "I've met Miss Ruth," he said, referring to the teacher who had called in during the debate. "She's no actress. She taught in Garland, Texas. I interviewed her back in 2000 about teachers quitting because kids from poor families weren't getting the support they needed." Everything she said was true. The opposition to Cruz's story wavered, not because they agreed with his politics, but because his story had touched a deep, raw place in their own pasts. The children they had seen overlooked, the kids they had written off. On TikTok, a video posted by a mother of 3 went viral. "I used to say Ted Cruz just cried on camera," she said softly. "I used to think like Elizabeth Warren, that the past doesn't define the present. But last night when that teacher said he wasn't stubborn, he was brave, I cried, because my middle child has been dozing off in 2nd grade all week, and I never asked why." The video surged, 6 million views in 18 hours, but the twist was far from over. That same evening, an old interview clip of Ted Cruz from 2016 resurfaced. Promoting his memoir, Hillbilly Resolve, Cruz teared up recounting his own struggles, once being disciplined for not completing assignments. "I wasn't lazy," he said. "I was carrying burdens, and I didn't know if asking for help was something to be ashamed of." The line echoed hauntingly like Cruz's words from the night before. Again, the internet exploded. When Cruz spoke of hardship, it deserved sympathy, but when he showed conviction, it became fodder for ridicule. A veterans advocacy group posted a side-by-side image of Cruz and Warren, each with their quotes. Cruz 2016, "I wasn't lazy, I was burdened." Warren 2025, "I wasn't stubborn, I was brave." What had changed? Because it wasn't about stubbornness or burdens. Within 2 hours, social media split. One side claimed Cruz was exploiting sympathy, the other insisted, "We're just being forced to confront ourselves." In a desperate attempt to repair his image, Senator Warren appeared on air. "I don't deny Senator Cruz's experiences," she said, "but I believe emotion should never guide national policy." Her statement was swiftly challenged by a college student's Instagram story. "If emotion doesn't matter," they wrote, "then why did she write an emotional memoir to be heard?" The debate spilled beyond politics. A primary school teacher posted, "I don't care who's right, Cruz or Warren, but today I know this. I won't punish the child who falls asleep in class. I'll ask, did you have breakfast?" In the days that followed, a flood of posts appeared on education forums, not from politicians or pundits, but from teachers, cafeteria workers, and single mothers. A teacher in Mississippi wrote, "Yesterday I asked my 2nd grader, 'Are you feeling sleepy?' She whispered, 'No, ma'am, I just haven't eaten,' and I didn't know what to say." Another woman, a single mother of 3, posted, "I used to watch Elizabeth Warren every night on TV, but for the first time, I cried when a woman simply held up a paper that read, 'He needs support.' I cried because I once wrote those same words on a food assistance application 10 years ago." The hashtag not stubborn, just principled, exploded across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. But this time there was no singular leader, no one claiming credit, no iconic face, just countless small stories, quiet yet strikingly similar. As always in politics, when a story spreads too fast, someone tries to stop it. A show on Freedomcast, known for catering to progressive audiences, aired a doctored video of Cruz's interview. They overlaid a sarcastic voice during the segment of Miss Ruth's call, twisting her arms. "He didn't stand firm because of principle. He's just stubborn or out of touch." The video ended with the line, "If Ted Cruz is America's political future, that future is being written with obstinance, not legislation." Within 3 hours, the video racked up nearly 900,000 views, mostly from left-leaning audiences. But this time the response was different. A respected fact-checking Twitter account released a frame-by-frame analysis proving the voiceover was fabricated and not spoken by anyone from the actual program. The expose was retweeted by multiple reputable journalists. Even an investigative reporter from Fox News confirmed, "Freedomcast distorted a real story, and that's more dangerous than bias." The public did not erupt in outrage, but responded with a unified act. They reposted the original video. No narration, no music, just Cruz holding the single sheet Miss Ruth had referenced, with the caption, "We don't need commentary, just context." As for Senator Warren, she avoided the media for 3 straight days. Her office released a brief statement. The senator respects differing viewpoints and looks forward to continuing dialogue on political standards. But her silence raised a question. Was she truly listening or just waiting for the backlash to fade. Meanwhile, Ted Cruz made no further public statements, no interviews, no heated debates. He simply posted a photo of the paper he had held that day next to a fresh, blank sheet. On it, handwritten to all those struggling to reconcile their beliefs with a changing world, was a simple message: I haven't forgotten. And you don't have to prove your worth just to be heard. No hashtag, no caption. But within 24 hours, the photo was shared by over 200,000 people. Among them was the daughter of Carson Green, the host of that intense debate night. She wrote, "My father used to believe strength was winning arguments. Last night he told me, maybe strength is when someone dares to share a memory they've hidden for 30 years. Schools began posting quotes from the debate as reminders. Not Cruz's photo, but Miss Ruth's words. He wasn't stubborn, he was principled, and no one asked why. In California, an elementary school printed that line directly on their free breakfast menus as a commitment. A principal in Boston said, "I don't want my students to carry Cruz's story, but I want my teachers to carry Miss Ruth's perspective." During a private congressional meeting, a young moderate representative stood up and said, "We spent too long debating who deserves what. Maybe the better question is, who just needs someone to ask him, why didn't you finish your homework today?" No one replied, no one objected. And through all these shifts, Ted Cruz remained silent. No media campaign, no inspirational tour. He simply showed up again at a routine committee meeting. No cameras, no reporters, just Ted Cruz, wearing an old suit, and that now slightly wrinkled piece of paper, laminated again, tucked neatly into his left breast pocket. When someone asked him, "Aren't you going to respond to the edited video?" he simply smiled and said, "Truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand firm." 1 week after the debate, a photo quietly began appearing on the walls of law offices, university libraries, and even bulletin boards in high schools. It was an image of an elderly woman with silver hair standing in a packed auditorium, her right hand resting on a wooden table, eyes fixed on her grandson seated in the distance. The photo captured the exact moment she laid down an old picture and then turned to walk away. No name written, no logo added, no filter, no flashy caption, just a single small line beneath the photo. Not everyone who lost the vote was unworthy. Some were just ahead of their time. That photo didn't spark a wave of likes. It didn't trend because of outrage. It didn't stir controversy like the usual viral clips. It simply lingered, just like the way he stepped forward, then walked away without a word. But that quiet moment became a symbol, not of victory, but the truth spoken at the right time. However, truth rarely comes without challenge. A conservative group called the Merit League re-edited the image of the paper Cruz held, adding a faded line beneath it, manipulated by stubbornness or awakened by principle. The image spread quickly. One side praised it as clarity amidst emotional noise. The other was furious, claiming it turned conviction into a tool for doubt. And just like that, the debate was no longer about Ted Cruz or Elizabeth Warren. It was about an old piece of paper with a trembling, handwritten note. In a suburban Kentucky classroom, a teacher printed the photo on A4 paper and added her own line. "If a child comes to class hungry, the first thing we should do isn't grade but ask, 'Are you okay?'" At an education conference in New York, the moderator opened with a question. How many here have stayed silent while watching a child get left behind because they couldn't keep pace with the norm? Nearly half the hands went up. Ted Cruz never spoke to the media again about the incident. He didn't rebut the mockery. He didn't respond to the edited videos or memes. He didn't explain more about the years he stood alone. He simply let the story move forward, not through his voice, but through those who saw themselves in it. And maybe that was the strongest response of all. He didn't need to win the argument. He just needed the truth to stand at the right time.